live in the state of Washington, in the Pacific Northwest. I used to work at a late-night diner on the side of the highway. I was 29 years old. I worked the closing shift pretty often. The diner would close at 2 a.m., which was incredibly late, considering how scarcely populated the area is. But even so, given the proximity to the highway, there would usually be at least one or two customers in the building until closing time. Having grown up in the South and moved up here, I can tell you, the people are different. In the South, there's a huge emphasis on hospitality and small talk. But up here, people are kind, though not overly friendly. I feel like the air lends itself more to introversion. I used to be a waitress down south, and I'm telling you from experience, the customers were a lot chattier down there. Up here, people seem to want to keep to themselves a little more. It was approaching closing time. The kitchen's last call was at 2 a.m. Technically, even though the diner was advertised to close at 2, it was really frowned upon if a customer came in and ordered something that late. But it did happen. In fact, it happened that night. There were only 2 employees in the building, myself and the chef. It was about 1:50 a.m., and in comes a lone, heavy-set man. He was wearing awkwardly high jeans, a brown jacket, and had a brown mustache and glasses. I asked him if he'd like to sit at the bar or a table, and he asked for a table. He kept smiling the whole time, so I smiled back. I gave him a menu and informed him the kitchen closes in 10 minutes. He looked at the menu for a few seconds, then said he'd like a black coffee and some French toast. Around this time, he also introduced himself as Nolan. Luckily, his order was simple enough. I went into the kitchen and told the chef the order, who still had a slightly annoyed face and reaction, to which I just responded, "I know." I stepped back out to the dining area, and Nolan waved me over. As I neared, he struck up a conversation with me, something rather unusual for folk around here at this hour. He asked if I was from the area and started complaining about all the potholes in the road. I responded, "Yeah, it's all the freezes we get in the winter." Basic small talk. I did tell him I was from around here, and he, perhaps, pressed a bit too specifically about where I was from. I told him a vague general area. I never tell people exactly where I live, obviously. He said he had just moved to town not too long ago. As he spoke, I analyzed his body language and character in general. He seemed like a somewhat nerdy older guy, and this may have been his idea of flirting. It didn't bother me much, though. I dealt with it back home in the South all the time, so I was used to it. Since this was the last customer of the night, the chef personally came out and placed his food on the counter. I went to grab it and bring it to Nolan. By this point, he had his food and coffee, and everything else was about ready to close up shop. I wiped down the counters, tables, and everything else. I stayed behind the counter, a little further away from Nolan, because I was tired of conversing with him. My social energy was drained, and I was ready to get home and go to sleep. When he finally finished his food, I went to drop off his check before he even asked for it, politely and non-verbally, implying that we were closed and wanted to go home. He paid by card and then left. The chef would be the one closing up the place, so after cleaning Nolan's table and gathering all my belongings, I said goodbye to the chef and walked out to my car. There were 3 cars in the lot, mine, the chef's, and a third one that I couldn't explain. It was a silver, older-looking car, like a 2005 Toyota or Audi or something. I wasn't sure. I also couldn't tell if the windows were tinted or if it was just so dark out that I couldn't see inside the car, but I wasn't able to tell if someone was in it or not. It was parked on the dirt closest to the highway. I wondered if it was Nolan's car. I got in my car and started heading home. The diner to my home is about 20 minutes. I was on the highway when a ding from my dashboard alerted me, and the tire pressure screen popped up. I started freaking out. I didn't know how to change a tire. I'd never even called my roadside assistance company. I was still a decent way from home. The tire pressure on my rear passenger side tire was dropping rather rapidly, from 20 down to 10. And then I started feeling not just the steering wheel shake, but the entire car shake. I had to pull off the road. I came to a stop and got out of the car real quick to look at the tire. It was as flat as could be. Suddenly, as if they were just flicked on, a pair of headlights lit up the side of the road as it approached me. slowing to a stop. I hurried back inside my car and locked the door. I truly didn't know what to do, and then there was a light tap at my window. I looked up and saw Nolan, the man from the restaurant. He waved at me with a smile. He was wearing gloves now. For the sake of the story, I'll use a fake name for myself. Nolan said through the window, "Kathy, is that you? Are you okay?" He laughed, acting like it was such a coincidence. I felt a knot in my stomach suddenly. I instantly knew he did this. I'm not a dumbass. He motioned for me to lower the window. I lowered it literally maybe 2 inches, just enough to speak through. He asked if I needed help. I told him I had a flat tire. He played dumb, asking me which one. I said the back passenger side. He started walking over to the other side, and at this moment, I dialed 911 on my phone. I let the phone sit on my lap as Nolan walked back to my side. He said through the window, with his creepy smile, that he knew how to change a flat. He asked me to step out of the car, and I said I'm waiting for my boyfriend to come and help me change it. During all of this, I heard the 911 operator speaking into the phone, but it wasn't loud enough for Nolan to hear. I tried to make it as clear as possible to the operator without being too obvious for Nolan to catch on. I basically said, I'm not sure how I got a flat, but I'm waiting for my boyfriend to come help me change it. Thanks for offering to help, sir. He stood there for a second with a much less friendly look on his face. Then he walked away from the window. I took this opportunity to speak very quietly into the phone, telling the operator that this man slashed my tire and was trying to get me out of the car. The operator asked my location, and I quickly opened the map on my phone and told her the name of the road I pulled off onto. The deafening sound of shattering glass immediately to my left made me scream as shards of glass fell onto my lap. I screamed at the top of my lungs at the man. I'm on the phone with the police. As I showed him the phone screen, he looked at it and then reached inside the car. I screamed again, hysterically crying, expecting him to try and grab or choke me. But instead, he grabbed my phone and launched it toward the highway. He then ran back to his car and sped off down the dark road. I heard the screeching of his tires as he made a sharp right turn and disappeared. I wanted to look for my phone, but with no flashlights in the car, I'd be running out there in the pitch dark. The only light was from my car. I had no choice but to wait and pray that Nolan, or whatever his real name was, didn't come back. I was very grateful I was able to tell the 911 operator my location in time. I heard the unmistakable sound of police sirens in the distance and started to cry tears of joy when I realized they were getting closer. I got out of my car and started waving my arms in the air until I saw the flashing lights turn off the highway onto the random road. Pretty soon, a second police car showed up, and then a third. During all this time, we found my phone, which was completely destroyed. I described the man to them, along with his car, and pointed in the direction he went. One of the police officers left in that direction, as they also put the word out on their radio. They were honestly the nicest cops I'd ever met in my life. They changed my tire for me, and one even gave me an escort home, having me follow from behind. The main officer told me they would investigate the video surveillance from the diner and keep me updated with any news. I got a call a week later from that officer, informing me that the investigation was still ongoing based on the surveillance footage. That was the last I'd heard of it. I don't think they caught him, sadly. I never returned to that diner job again after that night. I wasn't risking that man ever finding me again. I'm a 15-year-old guy working at an amusement park in upstate New York. This only happened a year ago, and it still gives me chills thinking about it. It was a crisp October Sunday, one of the last few days the park would be open until it closed for the winter in May. It seemed like just another normal day at work. Boy, was I wrong. After checking in and working at my station for about 5 hours, I looked at my watch. 4:55 p.m. was the time. My shift ended in 5 minutes. I felt relieved and exhausted. As I began packing up my things, a man with a scraggly beard and messy hair approached me. He was wearing a gray t-shirt with a few stains on it and black sweatpants covered in holes. I thought to myself, I just need to get through this last one. Can I help you? I asked the man. He stared at me for a few seconds and then kept turning his head as if someone were following him. I was starting to get a little creeped out. "Sir, can I help you?" I repeated my question, starting to sound a little annoyed. He looked at me for a couple of seconds and finally responded, saying with a stutter, "Where are your bathrooms?" He said this in a whispery tone of voice. "Up the hill to the right," I responded cheerfully. The man started to walk in that direction. As he did, he kept turning and looking at me. I avoided eye contact, even though I was more freaked out than ever. The next thing I knew, one of my coworkers came to take my spot. I grabbed my things, practically sprinted through the park to the back room to punch out of my shift, and then headed to the bathroom. I changed out of my work clothes and went to the employee parking lot. I sat on a bench and waited for my coworker Jordan, who was 17, to pick me up. After waiting for what seemed like hours, Jordan finally arrived. Before going home, we went to the local diner to eat some cheeseburgers for dinner. While eating in the diner, I noticed something odd. The same man I had helped find the bathrooms at the park was at the diner, sitting a couple of tables down, staring right at me. My heart skipped a beat. I told Jordan about it, and he just shrugged it off. "Probably just a coincidence, Ben, don't worry." "Yeah," I said, even though I was pretty concerned. After dinner, we got back in the car and started the 35-minute drive back home. At the first red light we came to, I saw something that made my heart skip another beat. There, sitting in his white Honda to the right of us, was the man from the park and diner. Sure enough, he was staring back at me. I told Jordan, and he started to worry a little. After arriving on our street, we made sure to take a couple of laps around the block to make sure the man wasn't following us. Once it was clear, Jordan dropped me off at home. My mom and sister were out at the mall, and my dad was on a business trip, so I was home alone. After immediately jumping into bed, I heard a noise at my window. I slowly got up, looked outside, and saw something that will forever send chills down my spine. Right there on my front lawn was the man, looking right at my window, smiling. I immediately grabbed my phone and called 911. But once the police arrived, the man was gone. I quit my job at the amusement park right after it closed for winter. I haven't seen the man since this incident. This was an experience that I'll never forget. I was working a late-night shift at the diner where I'd been employed for a year. It was a rainy night. In fact, it was pouring. Nights like these usually meant fewer customers because people aren't exactly rushing to drive in the rain. I was expecting a slow night, and for the most part, it was. I was working until midnight. At some point, closer to the end of my shift, a man and a woman walked in. The man looked significantly older, around 40, while she appeared to be in her 20s. They both glanced at me as soon as they entered, so I went over to greet them and ask how many. They said, "Just 2. So I seated them at a table. They took a while to order, and I noticed they were talking quietly to each other. After they finally ordered, the man started striking up a conversation with me. I'm generally a talkative person, which is why I've always thrived in the hospitality industry. So I started chatting with them since it was a slow night anyway. It was typical waitress-customer back and forth. Oddly, the girl didn't say much. The man did most of the talking, so I directed my questions more toward him. I can't remember every detail of our conversation, but one thing that stuck in my head was when the man asked me, "Do you live alone?" I did live alone, and still do. I answered honestly, saying I lived about 10 minutes north, and that it was really quiet and boring around here. At the time, I didn't see his question as a red flag, just a bit strange. But something about a man being with another woman makes you automatically assume they're not a threat. I made jokes about being stuck here forever and such, then walked away from the table. About 45 minutes later, they finished and left. Fast forward probably an hour, and we were closing up the place. I said goodbye to my coworkers and rushed to my car to avoid getting more soaked than necessary. It was still pouring. I drove home slowly due to the weather. As soon as I got home, I ran straight to the front door and let myself in. I didn't even notice that none of the other tenants' cars were parked outside. My living situation was on the middle floor of a house divided into 3 apartments. There's a side entrance with a stairway leading to all 3 floors. Since I was on the first floor, I could enter through the front door. After setting my keys and belongings down on the kitchen counter, there was a manic pounding at the front door. It was nearly 1 a.m. I had no idea who it could be, besides maybe one of the other tenants. There are 2 doors, a glass storm door and an inner door. I always keep both locked for safety. I opened the inner door and saw a girl on the other side of the storm door. She was drenched, wearing a gray sweater with the hood up, partially obscuring her face. She begged me through the door to let her in so she could use a phone. Before doing that, I wanted to feel her out, of course. I asked if she was lost. She replied that a creepy man had been following her and she needed help. Something about this girl struck me as familiar. I asked who the man was and where he was. She turned around and said, "I don't know." She kept begging me to open the door and even tried to open it herself. Suddenly, I realized why she looked familiar. She was the girl from the diner with that man. So I asked her, "Weren't you at my diner earlier?" She didn't acknowledge my question. Maybe she didn't hear me. But then she turned around again, freaking out, pounding on the door, yelling, "There he is." I looked beyond her to the street and saw a large man slowly walking toward the house. As he got closer, the girl looked at me with confusion, as if wondering why I wasn't opening the door. The man got close enough for me to recognize him. It was the same man from the diner. The girl must have seen the realization in my eyes because she turned to him and screamed, "Go!" He started charging toward the door, and I slammed the inner door shut and locked it. I didn't hear any knocks or bangs after that. I wasn't about to check if they were still there. I went to the stairway to knock on the upstairs tenant's door. The stairway was separated from the 3 apartments by a door on each level. After knocking a bunch of times, no one answered. I did the same thing at the downstairs door. Still no answer. That's when I realized, looking out the windows, that none of their cars were parked there. I was alone in the house. I went back to my apartment and locked the stairway door. My mind was racing, trying to come up with possible explanations. The most obvious was that it had been a trap to get me to open the door so they could rob me, or worse. Suddenly, it made sense why that man had asked if I lived alone. I sat on the couch for a few minutes, thinking. All I could hear was the sound of the pouring rain outside. I thought about calling the police, but chose not to. After a few minutes, I went to the bathroom to brush my teeth and get ready for bed when I heard a knocking sound. I stepped out of the bathroom to listen. It was definitely a knock. It was coming from the stairway door. I walked over, thinking it was one of the tenants. I asked, "Who is it?" There was no verbal response, but the knocking continued. I called out the names of the other tenants. No response. The only thing I could think to say was, "If you don't identify yourself, I'm calling the police." I practically screamed it. Whoever was there must have heard me because they knocked again. I yelled, "What do you want?" And a voice from the other side replied, "Your blood on me." I ran to my room, locked myself inside, and called the police. I hid in my closet while I was on the phone and stayed there. The sounds of the rain, wind, and thunder constantly startled me. Every little noise inside the house made me jump. It felt like the longest 10 minutes of my life before I was told to let the police in. They wrote a report, checked the front and backyard, and suggested I find another place to sleep for a few nights. I took their advice, packed a bag, and drove to my parents' house. The next day, I returned to the house. There was a knock at the stairway door, and this time it was actually my neighbor from upstairs. I opened the door, and he pointed to it and asked, "What's this about?" I was horrified to see a message written on the door in marker, "Thanks for the service, Beth." I couldn't stay there for a while. I moved in with my parents for a few weeks until it blew over. The following month, I found a new apartment nearby. Better safe than sorry.